Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The heat in Nevada can make you do stupid things. And maybe that's my excuse for ignoring every warning I got that Saturday in early September. I'd been driving through the desert for weeks, documenting ghost towns for my dissertation on economic collapse in mining communities. And honestly, after visiting 12 settlements that were nothing but foundation stones and rusty nails, I was getting desperate for something substantial. The old timer at the gas station in Searchlight kept wiping the same spot on the counter while he talked, his eyes never quite meeting mine, telling me about this place 40 miles northwest that nobody visits anymore. Not since the flooding in the mine back in '78, he said. Not since those families disappeared. But I needed this. My advisor had already rejected 2 thesis proposals, and turning 31 while still chasing a PhD was starting to feel like running in quicksand. The road out there wasn't on any map I had, just a dirt track that branched off the highway near mile marker 47, exactly where the gas station owner said it would be. My Subaru kicked up dust clouds that hung in the rearview mirror like ghosts, and after 20 minutes of washboard roads that rattled my teeth, I saw the first structures rising from the desert floor. There were maybe 15 buildings still standing, their wood bleached white as bones, windows nothing but dark squares that seemed to watch my approach. I parked near what looked like the old general store, its sign hanging by one chain, creaking in the wind even though I couldn't feel any breeze. The silence hit me first, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes your ears ring, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my camera and notebook, telling myself the unease crawling up my spine was just excitement about finally finding an intact site. The first thing that didn't make sense was the footprints. Fresh ones, maybe a day old at most, leading from behind the general store toward a cluster of collapsed shacks near the mine entrance. I followed them, my boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt, and that's when I noticed the trailer. It sat between 2 fallen buildings like someone had deliberately hidden it there. Aluminum siding still shiny under layers of dust. Definitely not from the mining era. A heavy padlock secured the door, the kind you'd buy at Home Depot, not some antique rusted thing. I was photographing it when I heard the music, faint, tinny, like an old radio playing from somewhere inside. My hand hesitated on the door handle, and I pressed my ear against the warm metal. Definitely music. Some country song I didn't recognize, barely audible, but unmistakably there. I should have left right then. Should have driven straight back to Searchlight and deleted the photos, forgotten the whole place existed. But I kept thinking about my thesis, about the rejection letters, about spending another year waiting tables while my college friends were buying houses and having kids. So I walked deeper into the settlement, documenting everything with my camera, taking notes on the unusual preservation of certain structures. The sun was getting lower, painting long shadows across the desert floor, and I found myself at the mine entrance, a gaping mouth in the hillside, reinforced with timber that looked surprisingly solid. More footprints led inside, lots of them, different shoe sizes, some going in, some coming out. The air flowing from the mine felt cooler, carrying a smell like motor oil and something else, something organic that made me step back instinctively. That's when I saw the generator. It was tucked behind a pile of rotting lumber near the mine entrance, a yellow Caterpillar model, industrial-sized with fresh fuel cans stacked beside it. The thing wasn't running, but when I touched the engine block, warmth still radiated from the metal. Someone had used it recently, maybe within the last few hours. My phone showed 5:47 p.m., and I realized I'd been there longer than planned, the desert already turning that deep orange that comes before dark. I started walking back toward my car, faster now, when I noticed something else that made me stop cold. Tire tracks, fresh ones, multiple sets, crisscrossing the main path through town. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it because I'd specifically photographed that area for its undisturbed sand patterns. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe locals used this place for parties, or perhaps someone was salvaging metal from the ruins. But those explanations crumbled when I reached my car and found a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, expecting maybe a warning from local teenagers or a note from another researcher. Instead, there was a single line written in pencil. "You need to leave before they count the inventory." No signature, nothing else. Just those 8 words that made absolutely no sense but somehow felt like the most important message I'd ever received. I looked around the empty settlement, at the shadows growing longer between buildings, and for the first time, noticed how many corners and doorways could hide someone watching. I threw my gear in the back seat and fumbled for my keys, every instinct screaming at me to get out now. The engine turned over on the 3rd try and I was reversing when I saw them. 3 sets of headlights in the distance, maybe 2 miles out, bouncing along the access road toward the settlement. They were moving fast, too fast for casual visitors or lost tourists, and they were definitely coming this way. There was nowhere else that road led. I slammed the car into drive and headed for the exit, but as I passed the trailer with the music, the door was open. Wide open, padlock hanging loose, and I could see inside for just a second as my headlights swept past. Rows of shelving, like a pharmacy, filled with labeled containers, and in the back, several people sitting very still on benches, their faces turned away from the light. My Subaru fishtailed as I hit the dirt road too fast, dust clouding everything behind me. Those headlights were gaining, eating up the distance between us like they knew exactly where I was going. I called my roommate, needed to tell someone where I was in case. The call connected and I started talking fast, giving her the location, describing the turnoff at mile marker 47, but the signal cut out mid-sentence just as I was explaining about the trailer. No bars, no service, nothing. The phone was completely dead even though I'd charged it that morning. In the rearview mirror, the headlights had spread out, one staying behind me while the other 2 disappeared onto parallel paths I hadn't even known existed. They were trying to box me in, and I realized with perfect, terrifying clarity that they knew this desert better than I ever would. The main road was still 10 minutes away, but suddenly there were headlights in front of me too, coming from a side trail that materialized out of the darkness. I yanked the wheel hard left, leaving the road entirely, praying the Subaru could handle the raw desert terrain. The car bucked and pitched over rocks and scrub brush, my teeth clacking together with each impact, the steering wheel trying to tear itself from my grip. Behind me, 2 of the vehicles followed while the 3rd stayed on the road, probably waiting for me to circle back. These weren't random locals or scavengers. They moved with coordination, purpose, like they'd done this before. My headlights caught a flash of an old wooden sign barely visible in the sagebrush. Grayson Mine Shaft 3. Danger, keep out. Without thinking, I drove straight toward it, hoping maybe the old mining roads would give me an advantage. The shaft entrance loomed in my headlights, a timber-framed hole cut into a low hill, and I saw my only chance. There was a dirt path running alongside it, probably an old maintenance road, narrow but passable. I killed my headlights and engine simultaneously, letting momentum carry me into the deeper shadows beside the mine entrance. The Subaru rolled to a stop behind a pile of rusted mining equipment, and I held my breath, watching through the rear window as the pursuing headlights swept past, then stopped, then started backing up. They'd lost me for a moment, but not for long. I could hear doors slamming, voices calling out to each other in the darkness, organized and calm like they were conducting a routine search. One of them had a flashlight, one of those powerful spotlights that turned night into day, and it was sweeping methodically through the area where I'd left the road. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying with the car, I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the passenger door, staying low, moving toward the mine entrance. The shaft went back about 30 feet before hitting a collapse, but there was a side passage, partially hidden behind fallen timbers. I squeezed through, the space so tight my shoulders scraped both walls, and found myself in a slightly wider chamber. Old tools hung on the walls, pickaxes, shovels, things that hadn't been touched in decades. and there was another narrow passage leading deeper. I could hear them outside getting closer, one voice saying they found fresh tire tracks leading toward the mine. The spotlight beam swept across the entrance, and I pressed myself deeper into the passage, feeling my way in complete darkness, my breathing so loud I was sure they'd hear it echoing off the stone walls. I stayed in that mine for 6 hours, moving deeper whenever I heard them getting close, navigating by touch through passages that seemed to connect in a maze of tunnels. Around midnight, the sounds finally stopped, but I waited another 2 hours before creeping back toward the entrance. My car was gone. Not a trace of it anywhere, like it had never existed. I had to walk 8 miles through the desert to reach the highway, hiding whenever headlights appeared, finally flagging down a truck driver at dawn who took me back to Searchlight. When I reported everything to the police, they found my Subaru 3 days later, hidden under a brown tarp in one of the mine shafts 2 miles from where I'd abandoned it. The engine was still warm, they said, even though it had been missing for days. The trailer was gone, the footprints were gone, even the generator had vanished. The only thing they found was my camera sitting on the driver's seat, all the photos deleted except one, a picture I didn't take, showing the inside of that trailer, rows and rows of people sitting on benches, all of them looking directly at the camera with the same empty expression. The Mojave stretched out in front of me like an endless ocean of dust and Joshua trees, and I remember thinking how perfect the light was that October morning. I'd been chasing desert kit foxes for 3 weeks straight, sleeping in my truck and living off granola bars and bottled water. The kind of solitary work that made my editor at National Geographic question my sanity every time we talked on the satellite phone. My divorce had finalized 6 months earlier, right after my 37th birthday, and throwing myself into documenting endangered species seemed healthier than sitting in my empty apartment in Phoenix. The assignment was simple enough: capture behavioral footage of the foxes during their breeding season, something that hadn't been properly documented in over a decade. I'd already gotten some decent shots near Kelso Dunes, but I wanted something special, something that would make the magazine's front cover and remind everyone why I used to win awards before my life fell apart. I turned off the main highway about an hour earlier, following a Forest Service map that promised an old mining road leading to untouched habitat. The dirt track was rougher than expected, full of washouts from last winter's flash floods, and my pickup crawled along at maybe 10 miles per hour while dust devils danced across the barren landscape. That's when I spotted the van, maybe a quarter mile ahead, parked sideways across the narrow road like someone had tried to turn around but gave up halfway through. Both doors hung open like broken wings, and even from a distance I could see camping gear scattered on the ground. A blue sleeping bag unrolled in the dirt, a Coleman stove tipped on its side, plastic water bottles reflecting the morning sun. My first thought was some city folks had gotten lost, maybe ran out of gas or got spooked by the isolation, because you'd be amazed how many people underestimate the desert and end up needing rescue. I pulled up about 20 feet behind the van and killed my engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of driving. The vehicle was a white Ford Econoline, probably from the early 2000s, with Arizona plates covered in so much dust I had to squint to read the numbers. No sounds came from inside, no movement except for a piece of paper fluttering on the driver's seat, held down by what looked like a thermos. I called out a greeting, then another louder one, but my voice just disappeared into the vastness around us. The smart thing would have been to radio the situation in and keep driving, but the scattered gear bothered me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Everything looked too deliberate, too organized despite the chaos, like someone had carefully arranged their belongings before walking away. The sleeping bag wasn't just dropped, but unrolled perfectly straight, the water bottles lined up in a row beside it, and when I walked closer, I noticed a digital camera on a tripod pointing toward the horizon, its red recording light still blinking steadily. The inside of the van hit me with a wave of stale air, and something else, something metallic and wrong that made me breathe through my mouth. The front seats were covered in manila folders, loose papers, and what looked like printouts from missing persons websites. Faces of young women and men staring up at me with hopeful smiles from happier times. But it was the document on the driver's seat that stopped me cold. A half-completed police report form from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, dated just 3 days ago. The officer's name at the top read, Deputy James Holbrook, badge number 4827, and the incident type was listed as Suspicious Activity Investigation. Most of the form was blank, but under the preliminary notes section, someone had written in shaky handwriting, multiple subjects confirmed at coordinates, appears to be underground storage, requesting immediate backup before proceeding. Below that, a topographical map of the area was spread out, marked with red X's at various points, and a dark brown stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood had soaked through one corner, obscuring part of the legend. My satellite phone was back in the truck, and every instinct told me to grab it and call for help immediately. But those red marks on the map, they weren't random. One of them matched exactly where I was standing, and another marked a spot about 2 miles north, near what the map labeled as Coyote Dry Lake. The bloodstain covered a third mark, but I could make out enough to see it was near an abandoned borax mine I'd passed yesterday. What really made my pulse quicken were the photographs paper-clipped to the folders. Surveillance-style shots of different vehicles parked at gas stations, rest stops, and campgrounds throughout the region. Each photo had a date and timestamp in the corner, some going back months, and I recognized a few of the locations from my own travels through the area. One folder was labeled Pattern Analysis in neat handwriting, completely different from the shaky scrawl on the police report, and inside were charts tracking disappearances by date, location, and victim profile, all centered around a 50-mile radius of where I now stood. The rationalization started immediately, that comforting voice in your head that tries to explain away the obvious horror. Maybe Holbrook was an off-duty cop doing his own investigation. Maybe he was a private investigator hired by desperate families. Maybe the blood was from a nosebleed or a cut hand. But then I found the deputy's badge under the passenger seat, along with his service weapon, a Glock 22 with a full magazine. And nobody, absolutely nobody in law enforcement leaves those things behind voluntarily. The radio mounted on the dashboard was smashed, wires hanging loose like exposed nerves. And when I looked closer at the driver's seat, I could see fingernail marks gouged deep into the fabric, as if someone had been dragged out while fighting to stay inside. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine cold but the battery still working, which meant the van hadn't been here more than a day or two at most. Through the back windows, I could see more equipment, zip ties, rope, a shovel, heavy-duty trash bags, and a handheld GPS unit still showing the last searched coordinates, which pointed directly to the dry lake bed marked on the bloody map. I should have left right then, should have driven straight back to civilization and let the authorities handle whatever nightmare was unfolding in this forgotten corner of the desert. But those faces in the missing persons reports kept staring at me, and one of them, a young woman named Kayla Brennan from Flagstaff, had disappeared just last week according to the printout. Her parents were offering a $50,000 reward, and in her photo she wore a turquoise necklace, identical to one I'd seen glinting in the dirt near the van's rear tire. The GPS coordinates on that handheld unit were only 2 miles away, and if there was even a chance someone was still alive out there, if Deputy Holbrook had found something before whatever happened to him, then I couldn't just drive away. I grabbed the Glock, checking the chamber and safety like my ex-military brother had taught me years ago, tucked the GPS unit in my pocket along with my satellite phone, and started walking north toward the coordinates, telling myself I'd just look from a distance, just confirm what was there before calling for help. The desert heat was already climbing toward unbearable as I followed a narrow wash that led toward the dry lake, my photographer's eye automatically noting how the morning shadows played across the ancient rocks and scattered bones of long-dead animals. Every few hundred yards, I found more evidence that someone had been through here recently. Fresh boot prints in the sandy patches, a crushed energy drink can that hadn't been there long enough to fade in the sun, and strangest of all, small fluorescent orange flags stuck in the ground at regular intervals, like someone was marking a trail. The GPS showed I was getting closer to the coordinates, and through my telephoto lens, I could make out what looked like a cluster of old shipping containers near the edge of the lake bed, their rust-colored surfaces almost invisible against the surrounding rocks. But it was the smell that hit me first, carried on the light breeze, a sweet, sick odor that anyone who's spent time in war zones or disaster areas recognizes immediately. Death has a very particular scent in the desert, where the dry air mummifies rather than decomposes, and this wasn't the smell of one body, but several, mixed with something chemical and sharp that burned the inside of my nostrils. The shipping containers were arranged in a rough semicircle, partially buried in the alkali soil of the dried lake, and someone had welded them together with steel plates to create one continuous structure. Heavy chains and industrial padlocks secured the doors, but one container at the far end stood open, its entrance a black rectangle that seemed to swallow the morning light. Fresh tire tracks led right up to it, multiple sets overlapping, and scattered around were more personal items. A woman's sneaker, a baseball cap with a University of Arizona logo, a wallet splayed open in the dirt with credit cards spilling out. I recognized Deputy Holbrook's handwriting on a notepad near the entrance, pages flapping in the wind, documenting license plate numbers, dates, and what looked like delivery schedules for something called Project Coyote. The last entry, written in increasingly erratic script, simply read, "They know I'm here, can hear the trucks coming back. If anyone finds this, the main site is 5 miles northeast, old Garrison Mine. They've been using it since 2018. At least 30 missing. Still alive underground. Tell my wife." The sentence ended mid-word, the pen mark dragging off the page in a long, desperate line. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the weight of the Glock suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever operation was happening here. Through the open container door, I could see industrial shelving stocked with medical supplies, IV bags, restraints, and dozens of those blue pharmaceutical coolers that hospitals use for organ transport. A generator hummed somewhere inside, keeping refrigeration units running, and a work table near the entrance held surgical instruments laid out on sterile cloth, recently used and waiting to be cleaned. The realization of what this place was, what someone was doing out here in the middle of nowhere, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just murder or kidnapping. This was something systematically worse, something that required infrastructure and planning and multiple people working together. The sound of an engine in the distance snapped me back to immediate danger, dust rising maybe 2 miles away and heading directly toward the containers, moving fast across the desert floor in a way that suggested whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Running back through the desert felt like one of those nightmares where your legs won't work properly, the soft sand grabbing at my boots while the sound of engines grew louder behind me. I made it to my truck and immediately called 911 on the satellite phone, but the connection was terrible, cutting in and out as I tried to explain what I'd found. The dispatcher kept asking me to repeat my location, and I was screaming the GPS coordinates when I saw 2 vehicles crest a ridge behind me, modified pickup trucks with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows. I threw the truck in drive and floored it, the rear wheels spinning before catching traction, and started the most terrifying drive of my life back toward the main highway. They followed for about 10 miles, staying just close enough to let me know they were there before suddenly stopping at what must have been some predetermined boundary. I didn't stop driving until I reached a highway patrol station in Barstow, where I spent the next 6 hours giving statements, looking at photos, and watching the disbelief on officers' faces slowly turn to alarm as they verified parts of my story. The raid on the containers happened that night, a joint operation between FBI, ATF, and local law enforcement that made national news for about 3 days before being buried under other headlines. They found the remains of 14 people in various states of decomposition, the underground facility at Garrison Mine that Holbrook had mentioned, and enough evidence to arrest 7 individuals connected to what investigators called a medical trafficking ring. But here's what still keeps me awake at night. They never found Deputy James Holbrook, dead or alive, and 23 people from those missing persons files remain unaccounted for. The prosecutor said the ring had been operating for at least 6 years, targeting travelers and drifters, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately raise alarms. I testified at the trial, showed my photographs, and watched as 3 doctors, 2 EMTs, and 2 men identified only as logistics coordinators received life sentences. But during the trial, one of the defendants smiled at me from across the courtroom and mouthed the words, "There are others," and I knew he wasn't lying. I still photograph wildlife, but I don't work alone in remote areas anymore. And every time I see an abandoned vehicle on a desert road, I keep driving and call it in from a safe distance, because some things in the desert are meant to stay hidden, and some horrors are all too human. Friday afternoon in early August changed everything about how I see the desert around Alamogordo. I run a small electronics repair shop downtown, and when Detective Vasquez walked through my door carrying a damaged phone in an evidence bag, I figured it would be just another data recovery job for the police department. He was a stocky guy with graying temples who explained they needed help accessing the contents of a phone belonging to a missing person. According to the report he placed on my counter, Natalie Dunn had just turned 26 in July, making her 2 years younger than me. She'd driven out here alone from Ohio to film content for her travel channel, one of those YouTube ventures where people document their solo adventures in remote places. Her parents had called the authorities after she failed to check in for 3 days straight, and search teams found her silver Subaru Outback abandoned on a dirt road about 15 miles from the main highway, locked from the inside with all her camping gear still packed neatly in the trunk. My fingers worked carefully around the spider-webbed glass as I connected the phone to my recovery equipment. When I finally bypassed the damaged screen and pulled up her GPS history, the data showed something that made both Detective Vasquez and me exchange worried glances. Her last recorded location was about 20 miles from where they found the car, deep inside what I immediately recognized as military-restricted territory near the missile range. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. on the night she disappeared, and after that, absolute nothing. Just that single frozen coordinate pulsing on my monitor, like a digital beacon in the middle of nowhere. Detective Vasquez leaned closer, his coffee breath filling the space between us, and asked if I could recover any photos or videos from that day. Natalie had filmed everything, apparently planning to edit it all into a vlog episode about desert camping. And as the video files began loading one by one, we found ourselves watching them right there in my shop, instead of just transferring them to the evidence drive like we should have. Her first video that morning showed her standing beside her Subaru at a gas station, huge sunglasses reflecting the early sunshine while she held her camera at arm's length. She had this infectious energy, talking about how she'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to capture the real desert experience away from tourist spots. Natalie explained she'd researched lesser-known areas around White Sands, spots where she could get dramatic footage without crowds of people in the background. She showed her supplies: 5 gallons of water, enough food for 3 days, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a bright orange tent she joked would be visible from space. What struck me was how prepared she seemed, checking off items from a laminated list while narrating her safety protocols. She even mentioned telling her parents her exact route and that she'd check in every evening at 8. The detective paused the video to make notes, and I noticed his pen hovering when she mentioned she'd hired a local guide named Carson to show her some photography spots, though she planned to camp alone. Video number 2 started around noon with the camera mounted on her dashboard, capturing the endless stretch of desert highway while she sang along to some pop song I didn't recognize. She pulled over several times to film the landscape, each shot showing her getting more excited about the isolation and beauty of the area. At one point, she stood on a rock formation and slowly panned the camera in a complete circle, showing nothing but desert scrub and distant mountains in every direction. "This is exactly what I wanted," she said to the camera, her voice filled with genuine awe. No cell towers, no buildings, just pure wilderness. Around the 4th hour of driving footage, she met up with Carson at a crossroads. A lanky guy in his 40s wearing a weathered cowboy hat who pointed out various directions on her map, his finger tracing roads that weren't on any GPS. Detective Vasquez asked me to zoom in on the map, but the video quality made it impossible to read the markings clearly. After Carson left, Natalie continued alone, following what looked like a barely visible dirt track that wound between clusters of yucca plants and Joshua trees. By late afternoon in her videos, the landscape had transformed into something almost alien. She'd reached an area where the sand had this strange grayish-white color, and she kept stopping to film herself sifting it through her fingers, marveling at how fine it was compared to regular sand. The sun was getting lower, casting these long, dramatic shadows that she used for artistic shots of her footprints disappearing into the distance. Around 6 p.m., she found what she called the perfect spot, a flat area surrounded by low hills that would block the wind but still give her a view of the stars. She set up her orange tent with practiced efficiency, narrating each step for her future viewers, explaining how to properly stake down a tent in loose sand and why she'd chosen this particular model for desert camping. While she worked, she kept glancing at something behind the camera and at one point said, "That's weird, I didn't see those earlier." But the camera was facing her tent, so we couldn't see what she meant. Detective Vasquez rewound that part 3 times, and we both noticed how her cheerful demeanor had shifted slightly, though she quickly went back to her upbeat narration. Her sunset footage was genuinely beautiful, the desert bathed in gold and purple light while she cooked freeze-dried pasta on her portable stove. She'd positioned the camera on a tripod to film herself preparing dinner, talking about how peaceful everything was, how the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. But around 7:30 p.m., something changed in the videos. She kept turning to look behind her, and twice she stood up suddenly and walked out of frame for several minutes, leaving the camera running on an empty camp chair. When she came back the second time, she forced a laugh and said the desert was playing tricks on her eyes, making her think she saw lights where there couldn't possibly be any. She tried to maintain her vlogger personality, but her voice had this strained quality, and she kept losing her train of thought mid-sentence. At exactly 8 p.m., she made her check-in call on the satellite phone, and we could hear her telling her parents everything was fine, that she was having an amazing time. But after she hung up, she sat there staring at the phone for a full minute before whispering to the camera, "I need to move the car." The next video clip started with the camera shaking wildly as she hurried back to her Subaru in the growing darkness. Her breathing was heavy and ragged, and she kept muttering things like, "This isn't right," and "They shouldn't be here." When she reached the car, she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice in the sand before managing to unlock the door. She threw the camera onto the passenger seat, and for a few seconds all we could see was the ceiling light and her arm reaching for the ignition. The engine turned over but didn't start. She tried again, pumping the gas pedal, and this time it roared to life. But then she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, and in the dim light from the dashboard, we could see tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave the tent," she said to nobody in particular. "All my stuff is there. They'll know I was here." She wiped her face with her sleeve and grabbed the camera again, and what she said next made Detective Vasquez pause the video to call his supervisor. "If something happens to me," Natalie said, looking directly into the lens. "Carson knew about this place. He kept asking questions about whether I'd be alone, and he marked something on my map that I didn't ask for. I think he sent them here." Detective Vasquez left to make his calls while I continued watching the videos, and what I saw next still gives me nightmares. Natalie had driven her car about a mile from her campsite, parking it behind a large rock formation, then walked back to her tent with just the camera and a flashlight. The footage was jerky and chaotic, her flashlight beam swinging wildly across the desert floor, creating monstrous shadows from every small bush and rock. When she reached her campsite, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her tent was exactly as she'd left it, but there were tire tracks circling it, deep grooves in the sand from what looked like multiple vehicles. She approached slowly, camera held high, and that's when we heard it. Men's voices, at least 3 different ones, coming from somewhere beyond the range of her flashlight. They were speaking in low tones, but one phrase came through clearly. She couldn't have gone far on foot. Natalie immediately switched off her flashlight, and the camera's night vision kicked in, showing her crouched behind her tent in that eerie green glow. She was trying to control her breathing, but small whimpers kept escaping. The voices were getting closer, and we could hear footsteps crunching through the sand, along with the metallic clink of what sounded like tools or weapons. For about 10 minutes, the video showed nothing but darkness and the sound of Natalie's terrified breathing. Occasionally, flashlight beams would sweep across the area above her head, and she'd press herself lower into the sand. Then came a moment that made me physically sick to watch. One of the men walked right past her tent, so close that his boots were visible in the frame for a few seconds. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and what looked like night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead. "She's got to be around here somewhere," he called out to the others. "Check if she doubled back to the rocks." Another voice, older and gravelly, responded from further away. "Told Carson this was too public. Should have waited until she was further into the restricted zone." They continued searching, their lights crisscrossing the desert. And at one point, 2 of them stood directly in front of her tent, discussing whether to slash it open to check inside. Natalie had buried her face in the sand to muffle her breathing, and the camera caught her whole body trembling violently. They eventually moved away, but not before one of them said something that explained everything. "Radio says the test is still scheduled for midnight. We need to find her and get out before then." What happened next was pure chaos captured in fragments of shaky footage. Natalie tried to crawl away from the campsite on her belly, dragging herself through the sand with the camera clutched in one hand. But about 50 yards out, a spotlight suddenly blazed to life, catching her in its beam. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the camera recording wild glimpses of ground and sky as men shouted behind her. We could hear engines starting and the sound of vehicles pursuing her across the desert. She ran toward what she must have thought was the direction of her hidden car, but in the darkness and panic, she'd gotten turned around. The last coherent video showed her stumbling down into a ravine, losing her footing on the loose sand and tumbling down the slope. The camera flew from her hand and landed several feet away, still recording. In the frame, we could see her lying motionless at the bottom for a few seconds, before she slowly pushed herself up and looked around frantically for the camera. Her face was covered in sand and blood from a cut on her forehead, and her eyes had this wild, desperate look. She grabbed the camera and whispered, "They're herding me toward the test area. They want it to look like an accident." Then she turned it off, and the next file was from her phone, just audio, recorded at 11:43 p.m. The audio file was 4 minutes of pure terror, heavy breathing, stumbling footsteps, and Natalie's voice barely above a whisper, trying to leave a final record. "I found a drainage pipe under the fence," she gasped. "Made it through to the other side, but I think this is the restricted area Carson marked. There's these concrete structures everywhere, old bunkers or something." In the background, we could hear distant shouting and what sounded like helicopters. "They're not following me in here," she continued, her voice shaking. "They're just waiting at the fence line. Why aren't they following?" There was a long pause filled only with her labored breathing, then a sound that made Detective Vasquez and me look at each other in horror. A mechanical voice over loudspeakers echoing across the desert. "Weapons test commencing in T-15 minutes. All personnel clear the target zone immediately." Natalie let out a sob. Oh God, they knew. They knew about the test. They chased me right into it. The last 2 minutes were her running, the phone apparently in her pocket, recording nothing but muffled thuds and her desperate breathing. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., The audio cut to static for about 10 seconds before ending completely. That static wasn't from damage. I've analyzed it 100 times. It was electromagnetic interference, the kind you get from a massive electrical discharge. Detective Vasquez returned with 2 federal agents who immediately confiscated all the files and made me sign a stack of non-disclosure agreements. They said Natalie had accidentally entered an active military testing ground, that her death was a tragic accident, and that Carson was just a local guide with no connection to anything sinister. But before they took everything, I'd already made copies. I'm not stupid, and something about this whole thing stank. I did my own digging and found out that Carson disappeared the same night Natalie died, and his truck was found burned out in Mexico a week later. The test that night? Officially, it never happened. There's no record of any weapons test at White Sands on that date. But I found something else. 3 other missing persons cases over the past 5 years, all solo travelers who'd hired local guides, all whose vehicles were found abandoned near restricted areas. The official causes of death when bodies were found were always exposure or dehydration. Natural causes, accidents. I think about Natalie every night, about how prepared she was, how careful, and how none of it mattered because she trusted the wrong person. I keep her last video backed up in places the feds will never find, because someday, when I figure out who's really behind this, the world needs to know what happened to her and the others. They weren't accidents. They were hunted. My Subaru's odometer hit 127,000 miles somewhere between Blythe and the trailhead, and I remember thinking that both the car and I had seen better days. At 37, with divorce papers still fresh enough that I kept reaching for a wedding ring that wasn't there anymore, I'd decided 5 days alone in the Sonoran Desert would either fix me or break me completely. Either option seemed better than another night staring at the ceiling of my empty apartment in Los Angeles. I'd been doing these solo desert hikes since college, back when my knees didn't protest after 10 miles, and a 40-pound pack felt like freedom instead of punishment. That morning in early October, I loaded enough supplies for 5 days and headed toward the Palo Verde Mountains, where forgotten mining roads cut through land that most people only glimpse from Interstate 10. My plan was straightforward. Park at the trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, and let the silence do whatever it needed to do. 12 miles in by late afternoon, my GPS showed an old service road that probably hadn't seen a maintenance crew since Reagan was president. I found a perfect spot between 2 ridges, a natural depression that offered wind protection while staying high enough to avoid any flash flood channels. Setting up my worn 2-person ultralight tent, I watched the October sun turn everything into shades of gold and rust, even making the decades-old beer cans scattered around look almost artistic. The temperature hovered around 75, with that particular desert heat that evaporates sweat before you realize you're sweating. No cell service out here, no emails, just miles of creosote bushes and the occasional jackrabbit bolting between rocks. I got my camp stove running for some freeze-dried pasta, optimistically labeled Alpine Minestrone, then sat on a flat rock to watch the sun drop toward the horizon. For the first time in months, that knot in my chest started to loosen. Just as the last slice of sun disappeared behind the western ridge, I stood up to grab my headlamp from the tent, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints in the sandy patch about 15 feet from my tent, clear and deep, like someone had been standing there for a while. The tread pattern was distinctive, some kind of military or work boot with deep chevrons, and they led straight toward my tent from the direction of the old service road. But here's what made me stop and stare. There were no prints leading away, just this one set coming toward my camp, and then nothing. I walked a full circle around my tent, checking every possible angle, thinking maybe the wind had obscured the exit tracks or they'd walked out on the rocky sections where prints wouldn't show. The rocks could hide footsteps, sure, but the approach was all soft sand and gravel, and those prints were fresh, maybe an hour or 2 old at most, the edges still sharp and crumbling. I tried to rationalize it while making dinner. telling myself that someone had probably hiked through earlier, maybe another desert rat like me looking for solitude. They saw my tent going up, decided to give me space, and backed out the way they came, stepping in their own tracks. It happens sometimes when you're trying not to disturb other campers, but the more I looked at those prints, the less sense that made. The spacing was wrong for someone walking backward, and the depth was too consistent, like they'd stood in each spot deliberately, watching. By the time I finished eating, full dark had settled over the desert, and I kept my headlamp on longer than necessary, sweeping it across the empty landscape every few minutes. The silence out there was absolute, not even wind through the creosote, just my own breathing and the tick of my camp stove cooling down. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of gravel shifting outside my tent. Not the random scatter of a small animal, but deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps trying to be quiet. The sound would come in sets of 3 or 4, then stop for maybe 30 seconds, then start again, always from the same direction as those boot prints. I lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle rigid, listening to what I gradually realized was breathing. Slow, controlled breathing just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent, maybe 3 feet from where my head was. I could hear the slight wheeze at the end of each exhale, like someone with mild asthma, or maybe just winded from hiking. My knife was in my pack's side pocket, but reaching for it meant making noise, and some primal part of my brain insisted that staying perfectly still was the only thing keeping that canvas barrier between us intact. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes according to the glowing digits on my watch. Sometimes it moved, circling the tent slowly, pausing longest near the zippered entrance. I kept waiting for the zipper to move, for fingers to test the fabric, for something to escalate this beyond just presence. But whoever it was seemed content just to stand there, breathing in that measured way, occasionally shifting their weight on the gravel. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sounds stopped. No footsteps walking away, no gradual fade into distance, just an abrupt end to the breathing and the gravel sounds. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I lay awake until dawn, my hand wrapped around the knife I'd finally retrieved, listening to nothing and wondering if nothing was actually nothing. First light couldn't come fast enough, and when it finally did, I unzipped my tent with the knife still in my hand, half expecting to find someone standing there. Instead, I found new boot prints, the same chevron pattern, but this time they formed a complete circle around my tent, maybe 6 feet out. The circle was perfect, like whoever made it had used my tent as the center point and walked around it multiple times, layering print over print. But the part that made my throat go dry was where the freshest set ended, right at the foot of my tent, toes pointing directly at where I'd been sleeping. The sand there was compressed differently, 2 deeper impressions like someone had stood in that exact spot for a long time, just watching the tent. I grabbed my phone to take pictures, needing some kind of proof that I wasn't losing it out here, and that's when I noticed something that turned my stomach cold. My phone showed 37 photos I didn't remember taking, all from around 3 in the morning. Every single photo was taken in complete darkness, the flash illuminating portions of desert landscape, and one recurring subject, my tent. The first few were from maybe 50 feet away, showing my little orange shelter glowing in the flash like a beacon. Then they got progressively closer, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5. The last dozen were taken from different angles around that perfect circle I'd found in the sand, each one showing my tent from a slightly different perspective. In one, you could see the shadow of my body through the fabric, curled up in my sleeping bag. The timestamp showed they were all taken within a 15-minute window, right around the time I'd been lying there, listening to those footsteps, gripping my knife. But here's what really got me. In the last photo, taken from right beside the tent entrance, you could see a partial reflection in the tent's rainfly. A face, distorted by the curve of the fabric, but definitely human. Male, I thought, with hollow cheeks and eyes that caught the flash in a way that made them look silver. I should have packed up right then, hiked the 12 miles back to my car, and gotten the hell out of there. That would have been the smart move, the sane move. But something in me, maybe pride or maybe just the stubborn refusal to let some desert creep run me off, made me decide to stay one more night. I spent the day hiking the surrounding area, partly to clear my head, and partly to look for any sign of where this person might be camping. The old service road showed tire tracks from maybe a month ago, nothing recent, and I found no other tents, no fire rings, no trash, nothing to indicate anyone else was out here. Around noon, I climbed to the top of the eastern ridge and scanned the valley with my binoculars. Nothing but empty desert stretching for miles, heat shimmer making the distant mountains dance. I told myself whoever it was had probably moved on, some weirdo with a camera who got his kick scaring solo hikers. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself the second night would be peaceful. I set up a perimeter of sorts, stringing paracord with my bear bell attached between some creosote bushes about 20 feet from my tent. Not exactly high-tech security, but it would at least give me warning if someone approached. I also moved my sleeping position, putting my pack where my head would normally be and lying the opposite direction in my bag. If someone was watching through the fabric again, they'd get the layout wrong. As darkness fell, I kept my headlamp off, sitting outside the tent and letting my eyes adjust to the starlight. The Milky Way stretched overhead, so bright you could read by it, and for a while the beauty of it made me forget why I was sitting there like a guard dog. Around 10, I finally crawled into my tent, keeping my boots on and my knife within easy reach. I lay there listening to the desert sounds, a distant coyote, the rustle of a kangaroo rat, the normal night music that should have been comforting. The bear bell never rang. That's what I keep coming back to, even now. My little alarm system stayed completely silent, but around 2 in the morning, I woke to find my tent glowing faintly from outside. Not the sharp, sudden blast of a flashlight, but a soft, steady illumination, like someone was holding a lantern just far enough away to light up the orange fabric without casting distinct shadows. The light moved slowly, circling the tent counterclockwise, pausing every few feet. I could hear footsteps this time, deliberate and unhurried, and that same wheeze-touched breathing from the night before. But what made every hair on my body stand up was the sound that came next. My own voice, playing from what must have been a phone speaker, saying words I'd spoken earlier that day while hiking. 37 and starting over, my recorded voice said, tinny and distant. Either fix me or break me completely. The recording repeated those phrases over and over, mixed with the sound of my footsteps on gravel, my breathing from the climb up the ridge, even the zip of my tent from that morning. When the light finally stopped moving, it settled right where my head should have been if I hadn't switched positions. The person outside pressed something against the tent fabric, and I heard the distinctive click of a camera shutter, followed by the whir of an instant photo printing. They did this maybe a dozen times, each click followed by that mechanical whir, and I could hear them carefully placing each photo on the ground. The breathing got closer, so close I could smell something through the tent fabric. Sweat, yes, but also something chemical, like darkroom developer fluid. Then, in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in days, raw and cracking, they spoke just one word: wrong. The light clicked off and I heard footsteps moving away, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking straight out into the desert. This time I could track them getting fainter and fainter until they blended into the ambient noise of the night. I didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, didn't even shift position until dawn broke 3 hours later. Outside my tent that morning, arranged in a semicircle where my head should have been, were 12 instant photos. Each one showed my tent from the exact same angle, taken moments apart, creating a kind of stop-motion effect of the fabric moving slightly in the night breeze. But in the center photo, circled in what looked like red grease pencil, was the faint outline of my pack through the tent wall, right where I'd positioned it as a decoy. The word "wrong" was written across the bottom of that photo in the same red pencil, the letters pressed so hard they'd torn through parts of the image. I packed up faster than I'd ever broken camp before, practically running the 12 miles back to the trailhead, my neck cramping from looking behind me every few seconds. My car was untouched, thank God, though I found one more instant photo tucked under the windshield wiper. A picture of me from behind, taken the morning before as I'd hiked away from the parking area, completely unaware I was being followed. I drove straight to the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Blythe and filed a report showing them all the photos on my phone and the instant pictures I'd gathered up. The deputy who took my statement, an older guy named Hernandez, listened to everything with this expression that got more concerned as I went on. He told me there'd been similar reports over the past 2 years. Always solo hikers, always in that same general area near the Palo Verde Mountains. Nobody had ever been hurt, but several people had cut their trips short after experiences like mine. They'd increased patrols on the service roads, but whoever was doing this knew the desert better than anyone. Probably lived out there full time, moving camp constantly. Hernandez kept the instant photos as evidence and gave me his card, said to call if I remembered anything else. 3 months later, he called me. They'd found an abandoned camp about 5 miles from where I'd been, hidden in a narrow canyon. Dozens of instant photos scattered around, all of different tents, different campers, spanning what looked like years. A collection of recorded sounds on old cassette tapes. Voices, footsteps, tent zippers, camp stoves. But whoever had been living there was gone, leaving only boot prints that ended at the rocks, heading deeper into the desert. They never found him, and as far as I know, they're still looking. I haven't been back to the desert since. The assignment had come through on a Friday afternoon, right when I'd been contemplating whether freelance photography was still paying enough to keep me in 29 Palms. Some boutique travel magazine wanted desert sunrise shots for their spring issue, offering triple my usual rate if I could deliver within the week. My landlord had been calling about February's rent, which meant saying no wasn't really an option. I loaded my Jeep Cherokee that night, checking the weather reports obsessively while packing every lens I owned. Clear skies predicted for the next 4 days. Perfect conditions for what they wanted. The editor had been specific about wanting something different, something that captured the raw isolation of the high desert, away from all the typical tourist spots everyone photographs to death. I left my apartment at 3 in the morning on Saturday, driving out past the main entrance to Joshua Tree and heading toward the northern boundary where hardly anyone ventures. The service roads out there were mostly forgotten, used maybe once or twice a year by maintenance crews checking on old communication towers from the 60s. I'd scouted the area on Google Earth the night before, finding a ridge that would give me an unobstructed view of the sunrise hitting the valley below. The turnoff appeared right where the satellite images said it would be, marked by a rusted yellow gate hanging open and a sign that read, "No maintenance beyond this point" in faded red letters. The road beyond looked rough but manageable, just packed dirt and gravel disappearing into the darkness. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and kept going, figuring the worst that could happen was having to reverse back out if things got too sketchy. About 3 miles in, the road started deteriorating fast. What had been packed dirt turned into loose sand with deep ruts carved by flash floods from who knows how many seasons back. The Cherokee was handling it fine though, and according to my GPS, I only had another mile to reach the spot I'd marked. The headlights kept catching Joshua trees at weird angles, their twisted arms creating shadows that made them look like people frozen mid-dance. I remember thinking how perfect this was going to be for the shoot, how the magazine would eat up shots from a place this remote and untouched. The dashboard clock showed 4:47 when I finally reached the ridge, giving me just enough time to set up before the golden hour started. I could already see the faintest hint of blue on the eastern horizon, that beautiful gradient from black to indigo that only happens in the desert. I pulled off the main track onto what looked like a flat clearing, perfect for parking while I worked. The sand seemed firm enough when I first drove onto it, compacted by wind and occasional rain into something that felt almost like concrete. I grabbed my main camera bag and tripod from the back, leaving the engine running with the headlights on so I could see what I was doing. The spot I wanted was about 50 feet from the car, right at the edge where the ridge dropped off into the valley. Setting up the tripod in the dark while wearing a headlamp always makes me feel like some kind of desert astronomer, adjusting legs and checking levels while the rest of the world sleeps. After getting everything positioned, I realized I needed my wide-angle lens instead of the telephoto I'd mounted, so I jogged back to the Cherokee to grab it from my second bag. That's when I noticed the Cherokee had shifted. Not much, maybe 6 inches backward from where I'd parked it, but enough that the front wheels had settled deeper into what I now realized was much softer sand than it appeared. The headlights were angled slightly upward instead of straight ahead. I threw the car into reverse to back it onto firmer ground, just a quick adjustment, maybe 3 feet at most. The wheels spun freely, that high-pitched whine that every desert driver knows means trouble. I tried rocking it forward and back, gentle on the gas, keeping the wheel straight. The Cherokee sank another few inches. The sand under the front tires had turned into powder, the kind that flows like water once you break through the crusty surface. I turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, my headlamp beam catching the dust particles still floating from my attempt to move. No cell signal, obviously. I knew that coming in. But I had water, food, and the weather was mild for early February. Someone would come looking if I didn't deliver the photos by Monday. I tried digging out the front wheels with my hands first, then with a collapsible shovel I kept in the emergency kit. The more I dug, the more sand flowed back in, like trying to make a hole in a bucket of flour. The sun was starting to rise behind me, painting the valley in shades of orange and pink that would have been absolutely perfect for the assignment. I actually took a few shots while I was thinking, muscle memory taking over even while my brain worked through the problem. By full daylight around 7:30, I'd accepted that I wasn't getting the Cherokee out on my own. The temperature was already climbing, probably hitting 70 degrees, and I could see heat shimmer starting to form on the distant mountains. I decided to record a video message on my phone around noon, when the heat was making me dizzy despite drinking water constantly. Just a quick thing to send to my roommate Wendy once I found signal, explaining where I was and that I needed someone with a truck and tow rope. I propped the phone against a rock and sat in the shade of the Cherokee, trying to look casual rather than desperate. "Hey Wendy, really stupid situation here," I started, managing a laugh that sounded forced even to me. "Remember that assignment I mentioned? Well, I'm stuck out on a service road north of Joshua Tree, about 4 miles from Highway 62, past a yellow gate with a no-maintenance sign. I gave her the GPS coordinates from my camera, described the Cherokee's position, told her to bring Keith and his F-150. The video ran for maybe 2 minutes before the phone screen went black. Dead battery. I'd been using it as a backup GPS all morning, and the heat had drained what little charge remained. The charger cable was in the Cherokee, but the car battery had died an hour earlier from my attempts to rocket free. The wind started picking up around 3 that afternoon. Nothing major at first, just enough to blow sand into my eyes whenever I stood up. I took shelter in the Cherokee, doors closed, watching the Joshua trees bend and sway through the dusty windshield. Then I saw something that made me sit up straight. Way off in the distance, maybe half a mile down the service road, a dust cloud was moving toward me. Not the random swirls from the wind, but a focused column like a vehicle would make. I grabbed my camera with the telephoto lens, using it like binoculars to get a better look. Through the viewfinder, I could just make out what looked like a dark-colored truck, moving slow but steady up the road. Relief flooded through me so hard I actually laughed out loud. Someone else had decided to brave the service road, probably another photographer chasing the same remote beauty that had lured me here. I stepped out of the Cherokee, waving both arms above my head, already rehearsing my embarrassed explanation and grateful thanks for the rescue. The truck stopped about 300 yards away. Just stopped, engine still running from what I could tell by the exhaust shimmer, but not moving any closer. I kept waving, even jumped up and down a few times, figuring maybe they couldn't see me clearly through the blowing sand. The vehicle sat there for what must have been 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Then slowly, it started backing up, reversing down the exact path it had come. I screamed at them to wait, actually screamed until my throat went raw, but the sound got swallowed by the wind. Through the camera lens, I watched the truck disappear back into the desert haze, that dust column gradually fading until there was nothing left but empty road and my own disbelief. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe they thought I was dangerous. Maybe they were lost themselves. Maybe they didn't even see me. But something about how deliberately they'd stopped, waited, and then reversed made my chest tighten with a fear I couldn't name. The wind got serious as the sun started dropping toward the horizon. Not a dust storm exactly, but what locals call a blow, where the sand gets picked up in sheets and visibility drops to maybe 100 feet. I huddled in the Cherokee, feeling it rock with each gust, sand hissing against the windows like static on a dead TV channel. That's when I noticed the other set of tire tracks. Fresh ones, maybe a few hours old at most, running parallel to the service road about 20 feet away. They weren't from the truck I'd just seen. These were wider, deeper, like from something heavier. The tracks went about 50 yards past my position before curving sharply back toward the road and disappearing. Someone else had been here recently, close enough to see my stuck vehicle but hadn't stopped or left any sign. I took photos of the tracks with my camera, switching to manual focus because the autofocus couldn't handle the blowing sand. In the last shot, just as the memory card filled up, I caught something else. Headlights in the distance, multiple sets this time, arranged in a pattern that didn't make sense for normal traffic. Night fell hard and fast once the sun dropped behind the mountains. The wind had died down to occasional gusts, but the darkness out there was absolute, the kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I turned on the Cherokee's interior light briefly to organize my water bottles, trying to ration what I had left for however long this would take. That's when I heard the engines, not one vehicle but several, circling somewhere out in the darkness beyond where I could see. They'd drive close enough that I could hear the crunch of tires on sand, then pull away again, over and over like some kind of game. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat, interior light off now, barely breathing. The sound patterns weren't random. They were coordinated, like they were taking turns approaching from different angles. At one point, high beams flooded the Cherokee's interior so bright I had to shield my eyes, staying on for maybe 30 seconds before cutting out completely. Then silence. Complete, total silence that stretched on for hours until I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Dawn came gray and hazy through a thick coat of dust on the windshield. The Cherokee was half buried, sand piled up to the bottom of the doors on the windward side. I forced the door open and stumbled out, my legs cramped from sitting rigid all night. The desert looked different, reformed by the wind into new patterns and small dunes. All the tire tracks from the night before were gone, erased like they'd never existed. My water was down to half a bottle, my lips cracked and bleeding despite the chapstick I'd been applying obsessively. I made the decision to leave the Cherokee and walk back to the main road, taking just my camera and the remaining water. But when I tried to orient myself, nothing looked familiar. The service road I'd driven in on was completely obscured, covered by fresh sand with no trace of the path. Even the distant mountains looked wrong, like I was seeing them from a different angle. That's when I understood with perfect, terrible clarity that whoever had been circling in the darkness hadn't been playing a game. They'd been waiting for the storm to do its work, waiting for the desert to erase everything, waiting for me to make exactly this choice. I started walking anyway, using the sun to head roughly east toward where Highway 62 should be. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and scan the horizon with my camera's telephoto, looking for any sign of the road or power lines or anything human-made. About an hour in, I spotted vehicles again, 2 pickup trucks parked on a rise maybe a quarter mile to my south, just sitting there with what looked like people standing beside them, watching me through binoculars. When I changed direction to walk toward them, they got back in their trucks and drove away, maintaining that same quarter-mile distance. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. Like they were hurting me, keeping me walking in a specific direction. The heat was brutal by mid-morning, probably pushing 95 degrees, and my water was gone. I tried doubling back toward the Cherokee, but every time I turned around, one of the trucks would swing wide to block that direction, forcing me to keep going east into increasingly rough terrain. By noon, I couldn't walk anymore. I found a small overhang in a rock formation and collapsed in its shade, my camera still hanging around my neck out of pure habit. The trucks had disappeared again, but I knew they were out there, waiting. I managed to turn the camera on one last time, scrolling through the photos I'd taken, the sunrise shots that had brought me here, the tire tracks in the sand, and that final image of the approaching headlights. I deleted everything else to save battery and recorded one more video, whispering because my throat was too dry to speak normally, explaining everything that had happened, describing the trucks, the deliberate way they'd trapped me. The camera died halfway through a sentence. That's when I heard a helicopter in the distance and started laughing, thinking I was hallucinating. But it was real, a sheriff's department chopper that had spotted the Cherokee's roof still visible above the sand. They found me unconscious about 200 yards from the rock formation. Apparently, I'd tried to signal them and collapsed. The rescue team said they'd been searching since Monday when the magazine called asking about the photos. The sheriff's department never found any evidence of the trucks I described. No tire tracks, no sign of other vehicles in the area for weeks, according to them. They suggested dehydration and heat exhaustion had caused hallucinations, which apparently happens a lot in rescue situations. Maybe they were right, but when they returned my camera from the Cherokee, that last photo was still there on the memory card, the one with multiple headlights approaching in formation through the dust. The sheriff's deputy who looked at it said it was probably just lens flare from the setting sun, combined with blowing sand, nothing unusual for desert photography. He seemed pretty convinced, even showed me similar effects in other desert photos online. I didn't tell him about the video I'd recorded on the camera, the one that should have been there but wasn't, like it had never existed. I didn't mention that the timestamp on that last photo showed 11:47 p.m., hours after sunset, when there was no sun to create lens flare. I just thanked them for saving my life, collected my insurance payout for the buried Cherokee, and moved to Portland 2 weeks later. I still do photography, but only urban stuff now, buildings, people, city life. Sometimes editors ask if I'd consider taking desert assignments again, offering good money for that isolated beauty everyone wants to capture. I always politely decline. Whatever was out there circling in the darkness that night, whether it was real or something my stressed mind created, I have no interest in meeting it again. My 14-year-old daughter Amber spotted it first, pressing her face against the dusty window of our SUV and pointing at something orange flickering between the creosote bushes. We were 2 hours into the dirt roads outside Furnace Creek, searching for a camping spot away from the crowds when she started tugging at my shoulder from the back seat. Her younger brother Max was asleep with his head against her arm, drooling slightly, exhausted from waking up at 4 in the morning for this trip. I'd been teaching 8th grade biology in Bakersfield for almost 2 decades, planning this Death Valley expedition since winter break, convincing my wife Lisa that we could handle 3 days of primitive camping with the kids. She'd finally agreed, taking time off from her pharmacy job, though she kept checking her phone for signal every few minutes, worried about being completely disconnected. What Amber had seen made me slow the vehicle to a stop, squinting through the afternoon glare at a half-collapsed tent about 50 yards from the road. Orange fabric whipped in the wind like a flag of surrender. One side completely caved in while the other 3 poles still stood at awkward angles. A ring of stones marked where someone had built a fire, the charred wood inside arranged in a perfect teepee formation that had long since burned out. But the strangest part was what sat beside it. A pile of clothing folded with military precision, each piece stacked on top of the other, as if someone had carefully organized their entire wardrobe before walking away. Lisa noticed them too, leaning forward between the seats. her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she asked why anyone would leave their clothes arranged like that in the middle of nowhere. Against Lisa's protests, I decided we should report it to a ranger, just in case someone needed help or had gotten lost out here. Max woke up when I turned off the engine, rubbing his eyes and immediately asking for water, while Amber was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eager to investigate. I told them both to stay in the car with the air conditioning running while I walked over to check things out. The ground between us and the abandoned camp was nothing but loose gravel and scattered Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching toward a cloudless sky. As I got closer, I could see more details. The tent was a decent brand, probably expensive when it was new, with reinforced corners and heavy-duty zippers. The clothes were all men's, different sizes of shirts and pants, even socks rolled into perfect balls, and strangest of all, a pair of hiking boots placed neatly at the end of the pile with the laces tucked inside. I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture everything from multiple angles, then jogged back to the SUV where my family waited. Lisa had that look on her face, the one she got when she had to tell relatives bad news at the pharmacy, all tight lips and worried eyes. We drove another mile down the road before finding our intended camping spot, a flat area protected by a cluster of large boulders that would block the worst of the afternoon sun. While Lisa and the kids started setting up our tent, I tried calling the ranger station, but of course there was no signal. We had a satellite emergency beacon for real emergencies, but this didn't quite seem to warrant that level of response. I made a mental note of the GPS coordinates and figured we'd report it when we drove back toward the visitor center for our Day 2 supply run. That first night passed peacefully enough, though I kept waking up every few hours, listening to the desert sounds outside our tent. Coyotes called to each other across the valley, their yips echoing off the canyon walls, and once I heard something large walking through our camp, probably a bighorn sheep based on the hoof sounds on the rocks. Lisa slept fitfully beside me, mumbling in her sleep about work, while the kids were dead to the world in their sleeping bags. Around 5 in the morning, just as the sky started turning purple at the edges, I gave up on sleep and crawled out to start the camp stove for coffee. The abandoned tent was still visible in the distance, a dark shape against the lighter sand, and I noticed buzzards had started circling above it, 3 of them making lazy loops in the warming air. After breakfast, we decided to hike to a small peak about 2 miles from camp, following an old mining trail I'd read about online. The kids complained for the first half hour, Max dragging his feet and asking every 5 minutes if we could turn back. But once we started finding old rusted equipment from the 1800s, they perked up considerably. Amber found a purple glass bottle half buried in the sand, probably from some patent medicine, and Max discovered what looked like part of an ore cart wheel. Lisa stayed close to me, holding my hand whenever the trail narrowed, still uneasy about the abandoned camp we'd found. We reached the summit around noon, the temperature already climbing toward triple digits, and ate lunch while looking out over the valley spread below us like a brown ocean frozen in time. That's when we saw the ranger's truck, a white speck moving along the road far below, stopping exactly where we'd seen the abandoned tent. The hike back down took longer than expected because Max had started developing blisters, and we had to stop every few hundred yards to adjust the moleskin on his heels. By the time we reached our camp, around 3 in the afternoon, the heat had become oppressive, turning the air into a shimmering curtain that made everything in the distance wobble like a mirage. The kids immediately retreated into the tent to play cards, while Lisa and I sat in our folding chairs under a tarp we'd strung between the SUV and a large boulder. We were sharing a warm beer, the last one from our cooler that had any pretense of being cold, when we heard a vehicle approaching. A Park Service truck pulled up beside our SUV, and a ranger stepped out, a tall woman with sun-damaged skin and wraparound sunglasses that reflected our camp like tiny mirrors. She introduced herself as Ranger Colton and asked if we'd seen anything unusual in the area. I told her about the abandoned camp we'd spotted yesterday, even showed her the photos on my phone, zooming in on the folded clothes in the collapsed tent. She studied each image carefully, her expression never changing, then handed my phone back and said something that made my chest tighten. That camp had been cleared 6 months ago, she said, after a 3-week search and rescue operation for a geology professor from UC Davis and 2 graduate students who'd gone missing. They'd found the tent exactly as I'd photographed it, clothes folded the same way, but no bodies, no tracks leading away, nothing to indicate where the 3 men had gone. The area had been thoroughly searched with dogs, helicopters, even thermal imaging drones at night. She said they'd removed everything, documented it all for the investigation, and she'd personally supervised loading the tent and belongings into evidence bags. Yet here I was showing her pictures from yesterday, of the exact same scene, down to the way the socks were rolled and the boots positioned. Ranger Colton asked to see the GPS coordinates on my phone, then radioed someone, speaking in codes I didn't understand before switching to plain English. She wanted backup to check the site again, mentioned something about another occurrence, and told whoever was on the other end to bring the special documentation kit. While she waited for the response, she walked around our camp, examining our setup with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, taking photos of our tent, our vehicle, even our camping chairs arranged around the dead fire pit. Lisa came out of the tent where she'd been checking on the kids, and I could see her pharmacy training kick in as she read the ranger's body language, the way she positioned herself between Colton and the tent entrance. The ranger noticed and forced a professional smile, telling us we should consider moving to the developed campground near Stovepipe Wells, that this area had been having some issues lately that they were investigating. We might have taken her advice if the kids hadn't been so tired and cranky from the heat, and if packing up didn't mean another 2 hours of driving on rough roads. Lisa and I discussed it quietly, while Ranger Colton walked back to her truck to make more radio calls, and we decided to stay just one more night, leave first thing in the morning. The ranger didn't seem happy about our decision, gave us her direct radio frequency and told us to call immediately if we noticed anything unusual, and I mean anything, she emphasized, even if it seemed minor. After she left, driving back toward where we'd seen the abandoned camp, the afternoon felt heavier somehow, like the desert itself was holding its breath. We made dinner early, nobody talking much, and we're all in our sleeping bags by 8 o'clock when the last light faded from the sky. I remember checking my watch at exactly 11:47 p.m. when I heard the first sound that didn't belong, the distinct metallic whisper of a zipper being pulled, slow and deliberate, somewhere very close to our tent. I lay perfectly still, every muscle rigid, listening to that zipper moving tooth by tooth in the darkness outside. Lisa was breathing deeply beside me, and I could hear both kids snoring softly in their bags, none of them aware of what was happening. The zipper stopped, and for maybe 30 seconds there was absolute silence, the kind that makes your ears ring from the absence of sound. Then I heard footsteps, not the random scuff of an animal, but measured, careful steps circling our tent, pausing every few feet like someone was examining our setup. My hand found the flashlight I'd kept beside my pillow, fingers wrapping around the metal cylinder while I tried to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped directly outside the wall where Lisa was sleeping, and I could hear breathing, slow and controlled, inches from the tent fabric. That's when I noticed our tent zipper, the main entrance, was moving, the pull tab sliding upward so slowly I could barely see it in the dim starlight filtering through the mesh window. The zipper had moved about 6 inches when Amber suddenly cried out in her sleep, a sharp "no" that cut through the silence like a gunshot. The movement stopped instantly, and I heard the footsteps retreat quickly, not running but walking fast, controlled, heading away from our camp. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent in one motion, bursting outside with the beams sweeping across the desert, catching nothing but empty sand and the shadows of Joshua trees. Our tent had been cut, a clean diagonal slash through the rainfly about 3 feet long, edges so straight it looked like someone had used a razor. I woke Lisa, whispered what had happened while she pulled the kids close, their sleepy confusion turning to fear when they saw my face. We packed everything in 20 minutes, throwing gear into the SUV without bothering to fold or organize, and started driving out with our headlights cutting through the darkness. About a mile down the road, my light swept across the spot where the abandoned camp had been, and the tent was gone, the fire ring scattered. But the clothes were still there, now arranged in a perfect circle on the ground with the boots placed dead center, laces tied together in an intricate knot I'd never seen before. We drove straight through the night, nobody sleeping. The kids huddled together in the back seat while Lisa kept checking the mirrors for headlights that never came. When we finally reached the visitor center at dawn, I marched inside to file a report with the first ranger I found, a young guy named Howell who looked like he'd just started his shift. I showed him the photos, told him about Ranger Colton's visit, the tent being cut, everything that had happened. He typed it all into his computer, nodding along, then stopped mid-keystroke when I mentioned Colton's name. He turned his monitor toward me, showing a staff directory, and asked me to point her out. But she wasn't there. No Ranger Colton on the current roster. No tall woman with sun-damaged skin matching her description. Howell made some calls, checked with dispatch about yesterday's patrol schedules, and came back looking puzzled. No ranger had been assigned to that area yesterday, and nobody had reported checking on an abandoned campsite or talking to my family. The investigation that followed turned up nothing concrete, just more questions that nobody could answer. The photos on my phone were real. The slash in our tent was real, but there was no record of Ranger Colton, no evidence of the abandoned camp when a team went back to check, and no explanation for how items from a cleared crime scene had reappeared 6 months later. The Park Service filed it as vandalism and suspicious activity, gave us a case number, and that was that. We never went back to Death Valley, never even talked about camping again as a family. Lisa found a therapist for the kids, told them it was probably just someone playing a cruel prank, maybe some locals who didn't like tourists. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those clothes arranged in that perfect circle, about whoever was breathing outside our tent, and about Ranger Colton, who knew exactly what was happening in that desert but doesn't exist. I still have the photos on my phone, proof that we saw what we saw, but I've stopped showing them to people because the looks they give me are worse than not being believed at all. The trail was supposed to be simple, barely 6 miles total, looping around a stretch of dry land dotted with brittle shrubs and sandstone ridges. I had driven out early that morning, eager to clear my head and take a few photos before the light faded. Hiking alone never bothered me. In fact, it was something I did to disconnect from everything that felt too loud. The plan was to park near the small rest area, follow the path to the ridge, and be back before sunset. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like a storm that never came. Even then it felt different from any hike I had done before, as if the desert itself was paying attention. I remember the silence more than anything else. It was not peaceful, just heavy, the kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own heartbeat. Every step I took kicked up small whirlwinds of pale dust that settled around my boots before vanishing again. My backpack was light, a single bottle of water, my camera, a snack bar, and my phone. The GPS app marked the trail perfectly at first, the little blue dot following the dotted line as expected. Then about halfway through, the signal flickered for a moment, and when it came back, I noticed I had drifted slightly east. I told myself it was fine. The sun was high, and I could always backtrack. By late afternoon, the heat had turned into something oppressive. The light changed in a way that is hard to explain, less golden, more like an old photograph starting to fade at the edges. I decided to cut across a flat area to rejoin the main trail faster, even though it was not part of the marked route. The ground was cracked and uneven, covered in thin white salt crusts that reflected the light almost painfully. I took a few photos out of habit, zooming in on a rusted piece of metal half buried in the dirt. When I looked closer through the lens, I thought I saw movement, just a quick flicker. But when I lowered the camera, the space was empty again. I reached a point where the GPS stopped responding entirely. The signal bar showed nothing, and every direction looked the same. endless pale ground and the shimmer of heat in the distance. I checked my watch, realizing I had only a couple of hours before dark. That was when my fitness tracker buzzed, showing my heart rate climbing even though I was standing still. I laughed nervously, thinking it must be the heat or dehydration, but the beeping kept speeding up. It sounded almost like a countdown, and for a moment I thought I heard something faint in the wind, a soft, rhythmic click, too steady to be random. The air had turned cooler, but the silence grew heavier, thick enough that every breath seemed to echo. I started walking toward a ridge that looked familiar, convinced it would lead me back to the main route. My shadow stretched long and thin, distorted by the uneven ground. That was when I noticed something strange. Faint indentations in the dust ahead, too wide to be animal tracks, but not deep enough to be human footprints. They ran parallel for a few yards, then stopped abruptly as if whoever made them had just vanished mid-step. I crouched to look closer, running my fingers along the edges, but the ground felt unusually smooth, like glass warmed by the sun. When I stood back up, I caught a brief reflection from something about 30 feet away. It was small, metallic, and half buried near a cluster of dry brush. I walked toward it, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots the only thing breaking the stillness. The object turned out to be a weathered radio, old enough that the brand name had faded off. The antenna was missing and the battery cover was sealed shut with dried mud. I turned it over, and as I did, it gave a faint click, so quiet that I thought I imagined it. Then, almost immediately, the air seemed to change temperature, like a wave of cooler air rolling through without any wind to carry it. I remember glancing at my camera, thinking I should record it, not out of fear, but out of a strange sense that I was standing somewhere I was not supposed to be. The lens captured nothing unusual, just dry terrain and the horizon bleeding into pale sky. But the sound in the background caught my attention. It was faint but rhythmic, a pulse-like tapping that came and went in short bursts. I looked around for power lines or loose metal that could be vibrating, but there was nothing. The desert stretched empty in every direction, and I began to notice how unnatural the quiet felt, as though something had swallowed up every sound except my own breathing. When I decided to head back, the GPS on my phone flickered again before dying completely. The battery had been at 70% minutes earlier. I told myself I could find the car by using the sun's position, but the light had shifted oddly, flattening everything around me. Every direction looked the same, just colorless ground and dry shapes that blurred when I stared too long. My heart was racing again, harder this time, and my tracker buzzed once more. I turned off my camera, zipped it in the backpack, and started walking fast. I kept thinking I was retracing my steps, but after a while I realized I was walking toward a place I did not recognize at all. After what felt like an hour of walking, the landscape began to play tricks on my vision. The horizon shimmered, and shapes formed in the heat, distant and uncertain. I could have sworn I saw a fence line ahead, but when I approached, it dissolved into nothing but twisted roots and sand. I called out once just to hear my voice, but the sound didn't carry. It died a few feet away, swallowed by the dry air. The silence was so deep it almost rang in my ears. I remember thinking that if I stood perfectly still, the world might stop noticing me altogether. When I checked my watch again, it showed the same minute it had 20 minutes earlier. The second hand ticked once, then stopped. I tapped the glass, convinced it was stuck, but it didn't move. For a moment I had the strange impression that time itself had thinned somehow, stretching and stuttering like a bad recording. The pulse from the fitness tracker continued, erratic now, flashing red every few seconds. Then came that sound again, the faint metallic click exactly like the one from the radio. It was behind me this time, steady, deliberate, like someone testing a switch on and off. I turned slowly, scanning the empty expanse. Nothing moved, yet I felt the air shift again, cool, then warm, like breathing in and out. My throat was dry enough to ache. I wanted to sit down, but the thought of stopping made me uneasy, as though the ground itself might open if I stayed too still. I kept moving, trying to head west, judging by the fading light, I found myself counting my steps just to keep rhythm, whispering the numbers out loud so I would not forget the sound of my own voice. The landscape had no pattern anymore. I might as well have been walking in circles. Eventually, I spotted what looked like my own footprints leading back toward a low ridge. Relief hit me hard enough that I laughed under my breath. The tracks looked fresh, too clean to have been made hours ago. But when I followed them, they stopped abruptly next to a small clearing, an oval patch of flattened ground surrounded by brush. My backpack was sitting there, zipped perfectly shut, as if I had placed it down carefully and stepped away. My shoes were beside it, side by side, neatly aligned. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought someone was playing a cruel joke. I took a step closer, certain I must have dropped the backpack earlier without realizing it. But the straps were spotless. No dust, no sweat marks, nothing that suggested I had carried it through miles of heat. The shoes were the same way, lined up like they were on display. A shiver ran through me, not from cold but from the strange neatness of it. I reached down to touch the zipper, and the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, I heard that metallic click again, louder this time, right next to my ear. I spun around expecting to see someone, but the space was completely empty. Even the light looked different, dimmer, like twilight had come all at once. I grabbed the camera from the backpack and turned it on, hoping the lens would catch whatever I was missing. The viewfinder showed the same patch of desert I stood in, nothing more. Then, for half a second, a faint distortion crossed the screen, a blur shaped almost like a person standing in the distance. The moment I blinked, it was gone. I hit record anyway, panning slowly around, my breath shallow. Somewhere behind me, that clicking sound repeated, this time spaced out, mechanical, deliberate. It echoed once, twice, then stopped altogether. I remember whispering, "Hello?" and realizing my voice did not echo back. The sun had almost vanished when I finally saw the faint shimmer of my car's windshield far off on the horizon. Relief flooded through me. I stuffed everything into the backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking fast. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was moving through invisible resistance. When I reached the spot where I thought the trail should reconnect, there was nothing, just unbroken desert. The sky had turned a strange shade of gray-blue, and I could not tell where the horizon ended. That was when the fitness tracker went silent. Its display froze, showing one last number flashing red before the screen went black. The final thing I remember is pressing the record button one more time, lifting the camera toward the empty land. The wind picked up for the first time that day, carrying a faint metallic hum that rose and fell like a signal trying to form words. The last frame I captured showed nothing but the cracked ground and dry brush swaying in rhythm. Then came that sound again, a single, clean click, and everything went dark. I work as a mechanic for a small auto shop just outside of Barstow, the kind of place where the wind never stops carrying sand across the parking lot. That afternoon was supposed to be simple. I had to deliver a replacement part to a client before dark, an alternator for an old pickup sitting on the other side of the desert. My boss had told me to stick to the main route, but there's always that temptation to shave an hour off the drive. When I saw the faded sign pointing toward Amboy Road, I figured it would be fine. The sun was still up, the air dry but bearable, and my truck had been running smooth all week. About halfway through the stretch, the heat began to build in that suffocating way that makes every sound sharper. The dashboard thermometer flickered past 110, and the horizon started to blur into that liquid shimmer you see above asphalt. I turned off the radio, just to listen to the hum of the engine. It had a faint metallic whine, one I hadn't noticed before. When I checked the gauge, the needle was creeping toward the red. I cursed under my breath, eased off the gas, and pulled over on the side of the road. When I lifted the hood, steam burst out like I'd opened an oven door. The radiator hissed and popped. I waited a few minutes, letting the heat roll off in waves before checking the coolant, bone dry. That didn't make sense. I'd checked it that morning. My phone had zero signal, but that didn't surprise me out there. The desert around Amboy Road stretches forever. No buildings, no signs of life except the occasional tumbleweed bouncing by like it had somewhere to be. A few miles ahead, I thought I saw something that looked like a billboard, just a dark rectangle standing out against the pale sand. It gave me a direction at least. I grabbed my water bottle and started walking, figuring I could reach it within half an hour. The air felt heavier with every step, like it was pressing down on my chest. My boots sank into the soft shoulder of the road, and the only sound I could hear was the crunch of gravel underfoot. That's when I noticed something strange. The billboard didn't seem to get any closer, no matter how far I walked. After about 20 minutes of walking, I realized I was sweating through my shirt, even though the sun had started to dip. The billboard looked warped now, like heat was bending its edges. My tongue felt dry, but I didn't want to waste water yet. Every time I stopped, the silence pressed against me. No wind, no insects, just the faint crackle of heat coming off the sand. I thought I heard a low hum somewhere ahead, maybe a generator or power line, but it faded when I turned my head. The horizon shimmered in all directions, and I started to lose any sense of how far I'd gone. When the ground began to slope downward, I realized the terrain wasn't as flat as it looked from the truck. The sand shifted to hard-packed dirt, scattered with sharp stones and metal scraps that looked half-buried. I saw something glinting near my boot and bent down, a rusted canteen, dented and dry. The surface around it had deep cracks, like the earth had been pulled apart and left that way. I started noticing more debris, an old tire rim, a shattered bottle, what might have been the edge of a sign. It hit me that this might have been part of a mining site once. The billboard wasn't real. It took me too long to admit that. As I got closer, the rectangle dissolved into nothing, just light playing tricks through layers of hot air. But beneath it, there was a dark pit, wide and jagged, as if the ground had caved in decades ago. The edges were lined with wooden beams blackened by time. My boots sent loose gravel tumbling into the hollow, and I heard the faint echo bounce back up much longer than I expected. Whatever was down there went deep. Standing on the edge, I felt an odd vibration under my feet. Not enough to be movement, but like the earth was holding its breath. I called out just to break the silence, but my voice came back warped, as if someone else had repeated it from below. For the first time, I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't find the direction I came from. The sun had dropped behind a ridge, and the desert looked identical in every direction. My truck should have been behind me, but all I could see was the faint line of tire marks leading in a half circle. I tried retracing my own steps, following the indentations my boots had left, but they curved in ways that made no sense. They looped and overlapped, like I had been walking in circles without realizing it. The air shimmered again, and for a second, I thought I saw the shape of my truck in the distance, its silver outline rippling on the horizon. I shouted, but the echo came back wrong, thinner this time, stretched out like someone whispering the last syllable of my name. The sound of it made my throat tighten, and I started walking faster, even though my legs felt heavier with each step. The ground around me changed color as the light faded, shades of red, brown, and almost purple blending together. When I glanced back, I couldn't find my own footprints anymore. They seemed to fade as soon as I moved away from them. My water bottle clanked against my leg, still full, but I didn't feel like drinking. My mouth was dry, yet the idea of swallowing anything made my chest tighten. I remember thinking how quiet everything was, how unnatural it felt to be surrounded by so much space and still feel trapped inside it. By the time the last trace of sunlight disappeared, the pit looked different. It wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore. It looked alive somehow. Shadows moved across it, shifting even though there was no wind. I stood there watching, convinced I saw something at the bottom. Small lights flickering like lanterns deep underground. I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks, but a faint rhythm started rising from the pit, steady and low like the thump of machinery far below the surface. I turned away, but the sound didn't stop. I started walking again, this time not caring about direction. My only thought was to get away from that pit. The desert swallowed the light quickly, and soon I was moving under a sky crowded with stars that felt too close, too bright. The sand reflected their glow in a pale shimmer that made the landscape look unreal. At some point, I tripped over something half buried, a steel beam maybe, and when I got up, my truck was there again, same spot, same open hood. The air above it still wavered from heat, even though the night had turned cold. I walked around the truck twice, trying to make sense of it. The hood was still warm, and the keys were right there in the ignition. My footprints led away from it, a single winding trail that curved back in a perfect loop. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd just gotten turned around in the heat and walked in circles until dark. But when I looked back toward the desert, the horizon flickered again, and I swore I saw that same dark shape where the pit had been, pulsing faintly in the distance like a heartbeat. I got inside the truck, locked the doors, and sat there until the first gray light started to rise. My throat burned, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the water bottle on the passenger seat. The silence outside was complete, not even a breeze to move the sand. I tried starting the engine, and it came to life without hesitation, as if nothing had happened. I drove slowly back toward town, following my own tire tracks until the asphalt appeared again. When I finally reached the main road, my hands were trembling on the wheel, though I didn't feel cold or afraid. Just hollow, like something had drained out of me. When I made it back to the shop, my boss asked if I'd gotten lost. He said the rescue crew had been called after the client reported I never showed up. They'd found my truck the night before, hood still warm, doors unlocked, but nobody around. According to them, they'd searched until dawn, following my footprints in a huge circle less than a mile wide. I wanted to tell him that couldn't be right, that I'd walked for hours into the desert, but the words wouldn't come out. I just nodded, pretending I didn't remember much after the engine gave out. It has been years since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. Sometimes I drive that route again, staying on the main highway, and I catch myself glancing toward the sand where the mirage should have been. There's nothing there, not even the faint outline of a pit. But once, just before dusk, I thought I saw a shimmer. A rectangle standing still against the horizon. It looked exactly like that billboard I never reached. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving until I saw the lights of town again.